The first fire destroyed my house. The second one was buried beneath the tree. The shovel struck metal 3 inches below the wet Virginia soil, and the sound rang through the quiet backyard like a bell nobody was supposed to hear. I froze with both hands wrapped around the wooden handle, staring at the patch of earth beneath the old oak tree. A cold March wind moved through the new leaves overhead, carrying the smell of rain, mulch, and something faintly bitter that pulled me back 1 year in an instant. Smoke. My name is Marcus Ellington, and 12 months earlier, I had stood in this same yard while firefighters walked through the blackened remains of my family home. The house had been rebuilt since then, board by board, almost exactly as my father designed it. The porch swing was back. My mother's flower beds were beginning to return. Even the oak, scorched along one side, had pushed out new green branches. People called that resilience. I called it evidence that some things refused to disappear. I set the shovel aside and knelt in the mud. My fingers found the edge of a small tin box wrapped in cloudy plastic. It was no larger than a hardcover book, but it felt heavy enough to carry somebody's future. One corner was darkened by heat, not rust, fire damage. I carried it to the patio table, where rainwater tapped against the metal roof above me. Inside was a flash drive, a brass storage key, and a folded strip of paper sealed in a sandwich bag. No name, no return address, just 7 words written in block letters. Victoria didn't order the fire. She opened the gate. For several seconds, the only sound was water dripping from my sleeves onto the concrete. Victoria Whitmore was already facing trial for fraud, falsified HOA records, and the harassment campaign she had used to force me from my own home. I had believed the fire was the final desperate move of a woman who thought fear could erase ownership. That note said otherwise. I looked toward the security cameras mounted beneath the eaves. The new system covered every gate, window, and walkway, except for one narrow blind spot between the tool shed and the oak. Whoever buried that box knew exactly where it was. When I pulled the footage, I saw a hooded figure enter at 2:14 that morning, moving with a noticeable limp. They crossed my yard without hesitation, knelt beneath the tree, and vanished before the motion lights turned on. They had not come to threaten me. They had come to finish what the fire started. I slipped the flash drive into an old laptop that had never touched the internet, the same one I used whenever a chain of evidence mattered more than convenience. The quiet hum of its cooling fan filled my home office while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Years in the courtroom had taught me one lesson that never failed. People lie. Paper usually does not. Digital records lie even less when nobody realizes they still exist. The drive contained only 3 folders. No names, no photographs, just dates, invoice numbers, and scanned documents that looked painfully ordinary until I noticed the addresses. Willow Creek Estates was only one of them. There were 18 different homeowner associations spread across 3 counties, all using the same property management company, the same accounting software, and the same legal consultant. Every month, thousands of dollars labeled as emergency maintenance quietly disappeared into subcontractors that always seemed to share the same mailing address. I leaned closer to the screen, listening to the soft clicking of the hard drive, while the smell of fresh coffee slowly replaced the damp scent drifting in from outside. Then I found my address. My house appeared in a spreadsheet dated almost 2 years before the fire. Next to my property sat a yellow highlight and 4 words that made my stomach tighten. Strategic acquisition. I opened the next document. It was an internal email discussing long-term redevelopment opportunities surrounding a planned utility corridor. Most of the neighborhood would eventually become valuable if enough original homeowners decided to sell. Some sold because of age, others because of financial pressure. A few because constant violations made staying no longer worth the fight. Suddenly, every mailbox citation, every fabricated complaint, every endless hearing Victoria had pushed against me looked different. None of it had been random. It had been a business model. I reached for the brass key that came inside the box. A tiny paper tag still hung from the ring. Locker 214. Richmond Union Station. No other explanation. No signature. Whoever buried that container had expected me to understand exactly what came next. Before shutting down the laptop, I opened the final file. There was no document waiting inside. Only a single sentence typed across a blank page. If you are reading this, they finally failed to erase the last homeowner who kept every record. I sat perfectly still, staring at those words while the rain grew heavier outside. For the first time since my house burned, I realized Victoria Whitmore had never been the finish line. She had only been the first door. I left before sunrise with the brass key resting in my coat pocket, its worn edges clicking softly against my car keys every time I turned a corner. Richmond Union Station looked exactly the way old transportation hubs always do. Polished stone floors carrying decades of footsteps, the faint aroma of roasted coffee drifting from a small cafe, and travelers moving with the determined rhythm of people chasing schedules instead of answers. Locker 214 stood against the far wall near the baggage area, scratched by years of use, but still perfectly functional. The key turned without resistance. Inside sat a weathered accordion file secured with a simple rubber band, and a plain envelope marked only with my last name. Whoever prepared it understood that the less attention something attracts, the longer it survives. I opened the envelope first. The letter contained only one page, typed with careful precision. It explained that the writer had worked inside the regional property management company for almost 9 years. They had processed invoices, board resolutions, and legal correspondence until patterns began appearing that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Homeowners who refused to sell somehow accumulated violations. Neighborhood boards approved emergency projects that never happened. Contractors billed for repairs completed only on paper. Every signature looked legitimate until someone compared hundreds of files instead of one. The writer admitted they had copied records for months before realizing someone else had discovered what they were doing. That was when they disappeared without leaving a forwarding address. I slowly unfolded the accordion file. Each section carried color-coded tabs identifying different communities, financial ledgers, engineering proposals, and confidential meeting minutes. My fingertips paused on one subdivision located nearly 80 miles from Willow Creek. For elderly homeowners had sold within 6 months after receiving relentless compliance notices. 2 years later, the entire block became a commercial development connected to the same utility corridor mentioned in the spreadsheet from the flash drive. Another file revealed identical timelines in 2 neighboring counties. Different neighborhood names, different board presidents, the same consultants, the same approval language, the same companies collecting payment. It was no longer an isolated abuse of authority. It resembled a carefully repeated blueprint. As I organized the folders across a nearby table, one photograph slipped free and landed face up. It showed a group of smiling executives breaking ground at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Victoria Whitmore stood near the back, applauding politely. She was not standing beside the man holding the ceremonial shovel. She was standing one step behind him, looking toward him instead of the cameras. A handwritten circle surrounded his face. Beneath it were 3 words that changed everything. Adrien Vale. Remember him. The afternoon sun stretched across my living room floor, while dozens of open folders surrounded me like pieces of a puzzle that had waited years for someone patient enough to finish it. Outside, children laughed somewhere down the street. Lawn mowers hummed in the distance. and Willow Creek looked exactly the way peaceful neighborhoods are supposed to look. That ordinary silence made the documents in front of me feel even more unsettling. Every page carried a different address. Every contract wore a different company logo. Every homeowner association had different board members. Yet the same names kept quietly returning beneath layers of paperwork, never in the spotlight, always somewhere near the bottom where almost nobody ever reads. Adrien Vale understood something most people never do. Real power rarely signs the final page. It simply arranges for someone else to do it. I spent hours comparing property records from 3 neighboring counties until my eyes drifted toward a large survey map spread across the dining table. Colored boundary lines crossed roads, neighborhoods, and wooded parcels before connecting into one continuous corridor stretching farther than I had imagined. Then I saw it. My house did not stand in the middle by coincidence. It sat on one of the last privately owned sections, preventing the entire route from becoming uninterrupted. Suddenly, every violation letter, every hearing, every complaint, every fabricated inspection fit together with terrifying simplicity. They never cared about my porch. They never cared about my mailbox. They never cared about landscaping rules. They wanted the land beneath my feet. I traced the corridor with my finger until another pattern emerged. Every homeowner who had endured relentless enforcement had something in common. Their mortgages had already been paid off years earlier. They could not be pressured by banks. They had to be pressured by exhaustion instead. Endless notices, endless meetings, endless legal expenses. The goal was never immediate victory. It was slow surrender. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the room toward the framed photograph of my parents. My father used to tell me that complicated lies demand constant maintenance, while the truth waits quietly for someone willing to read long enough. At that moment, I realized the anonymous whistleblower had never given me evidence against one corrupt HOA president. They had handed me the blueprint of a machine designed to make honest families believe leaving was their own decision. The courthouse looked different that morning, not because anything had changed, but because I had. Sunlight poured through the tall marble windows, painting long rectangles across the polished floor, while the familiar echo of leather shoes bounced through nearly empty hallways. I had walked these corridors thousands of times. Yet this was the first morning I hoped my title would matter less than my character. The evidence waiting inside my briefcase connected directly to my own family, my own property, and the investigation that was beginning to stretch far beyond Willow Creek. That meant I could not remain part of any future proceedings, no matter how confident I felt about the facts. Before my first hearing of the day, I filed a formal disclosure and requested that every case connected to Victoria Whitmore, Adrien Vale, or the expanding investigation be reassigned immediately. The administrative judge approved the request before lunch. Some people hold tighter to authority the moment it becomes valuable. My father taught me that real integrity begins the moment you are willing to let it go. Walking back to my car beneath a bright Virginia sky, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Peace. Nobody would ever be able to claim I had hidden behind a judicial robe or used a courtroom to settle a personal score. From that moment forward, I would stand exactly where every other citizen stands, with facts instead of titles. That afternoon, I met Senior Investigator Lena Ortiz from the Virginia State Attorney General's Public Integrity Division in a quiet government office that smelled faintly of fresh coffee, printer toner, and old case files. She never interrupted while I explained how a buried flash drive had led to property records, engineering surveys, anonymous testimony, and a development corridor stretching across multiple counties. She examined every document with the patience of someone who understood that truth rarely announces itself all at once. When I finished, She closed the final folder without offering dramatic promises or easy conclusions. Instead, she looked directly at me and said, "If these records hold up, this stopped being an HOA dispute a long time ago." As I drove home that evening beneath rows of towering oak trees, I realized something else had quietly changed. I was no longer carrying this story alone. For the first time since my house burned, the truth belonged to people whose only job was to follow it wherever it led. 3 evenings later, I pulled into my driveway, just as the last orange light disappeared behind the rooftops of Willow Creek. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Sprinklers whispered across freshly cut lawns. Porch lights flickered on one by one, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing important. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, the silence made every instinct I had spent a lifetime trusting begin to stir. When I stepped into the garage, the familiar scent of motor oil, cut lumber, and old cardboard greeted me like an old friend. Everything appeared exactly where I had left it. My workbench was untouched. The shelves remained neatly organized. Even the dust covering the concrete floor looked undisturbed until I noticed something near the back wall. A single set of shoe prints crossed the thin layer of dust before stopping beside the storage cabinet that had belonged to my father. They never reached the workbench. They never approached the tool rack. Whoever entered had ignored everything valuable inside the garage and walked directly toward one specific place. I crouched beside the footprints, studying the tread pattern without touching it. They were fresh, no more than a day old, yet nothing seemed to be missing. That unsettled me far more than theft ever could. People searching for money leave with money. People searching for evidence leave empty-handed when they fail. Before I could think much further, my phone vibrated. Lena Ortiz. She spoke with the same calm confidence she had carried during our first meeting. Independent financial records had already confirmed several of the transactions hidden inside the anonymous files. Investigators were now comparing similar patterns across multiple counties. She also warned me about something I had not expected. "Do not be surprised if someone tries to distract you," she said. "When people realize their secrets are becoming evidence, they rarely attack the evidence first. They attack the person holding it." The warning made immediate sense the following morning when an anonymous ethics complaint appeared against me through the Judicial Conduct Office. The allegations were vague, easily disproved, and completely unsupported by the public record. It was never meant to succeed. It was meant to keep my attention somewhere else. Standing alone in the quiet garage once again, I looked toward my father's old cabinet and finally understood the note hidden beneath its drawer. Trust the records. Never trust the timing. Whoever had walked into my garage had not been searching for valuables. They had been searching for history, and they were already too late. The following Saturday morning, I carried my father's old fire-resistant cabinet into the middle of my study before the rest of the neighborhood had fully awakened. Soft sunlight filtered through the windows, settling across the worn steel surface that had stood in our family home for as long as I could remember. As a child, I had watched my father lock those drawers every evening without ever wondering why. To me, it had always been an ordinary filing cabinet. Now it felt like the last conversation we had never finished. I removed every folder, every faded photograph, every tax receipt, every handwritten note, until the cabinet stood completely empty. Then I began studying the cabinet itself instead of its contents. My father believed important things should never be hidden in complicated places. They should be hidden somewhere ordinary enough that nobody thinks to look twice. Running my fingertips along the inside frame, I noticed one narrow steel panel that sounded different beneath a gentle tap. Hollow. A single screwdriver loosened 2 aging screws, and a tightly folded oilcloth packet slipped quietly into my hands. For several seconds, I simply stared at it without opening it. Somehow I already knew this was never meant for anyone else. Inside rested a strip of carefully preserved microfilm, 2 original engineering surveys, and a letter written entirely in my father's familiar handwriting nearly 20 years earlier. He never claimed to know the names of the people behind the land acquisitions. He never accused anyone without proof. Instead, he described patterns. Families pressured to sell. Property boundaries quietly changing. Utility planning that always seemed to arrive before public announcements. He believed those events were connected long before anyone else did. But he also understood that suspicion alone was never enough. Facts had to outlive the people who discovered them. As I compared his original surveys with the maps already gathered by investigators, every property line matched with remarkable precision. The development corridor had existed decades before anyone ever targeted my neighborhood. My family's home had never been chosen by accident. It occupied one of the final privately owned parcels standing between separate sections of land someone had been patiently assembling for years. I carefully folded my father's letter before reading the final sentence one more time. If these records ever become important, it means the land was never the true prize. The people willing to surrender it were. I sat there for a long time, holding the letter in complete silence, realizing my father had not simply left behind evidence. He had left behind the discipline to protect it until the right generation was finally ready to understand what it meant. By the time I finished cataloging every document, one fact became impossible to ignore. We no longer needed more evidence. We needed the right moment to let the evidence speak for itself. Lena called just after sunrise and asked whether I could meet at a small conference room inside a state office building 30 miles away. There were no signs on the door, no dramatic introductions, only a long wooden table, a wall covered with county maps, and 3 investigators quietly reviewing binders that looked remarkably similar to mine. The room smelled faintly of fresh toner and black coffee. Nobody wasted time with speeches. One by one, they laid out independent findings gathered from separate jurisdictions. Different witnesses had described identical patterns without ever knowing one another. Contractors billed for projects that never appeared. Property values dropped after coordinated enforcement campaigns. Parcels changed hands through seemingly unrelated companies before ending up under a single development partnership connected to Adrien Vale. My father's engineering drawings fit perfectly beside their modern satellite surveys, filling a 20-year gap none of them had previously been able to explain. For the first time since this journey began, I watched professionals who had no personal connection to me quietly nod as every piece locked into place. Then Lena unfolded a new aerial map across the table. Colored markers stretched across several counties, tracing the same corridor my father had predicted decades earlier. She explained that investigators believed the acquisition strategy had never depended on speed. It depended on patience. Pressure one homeowner today, another family next year, a vacant parcel 5 years later. Nobody notices a puzzle being assembled when only one piece moves at a time. Before the meeting ended, the lead investigator outlined the next step with deliberate precision. They intended to invite Adrien Vale to what appeared to be an ordinary business discussion regarding future infrastructure planning. Separate financial inquiries had already produced lawful requests for additional records, but they needed confirmation that he still exercised operational control over the network rather than acting as a retired consultant. Nobody intended to provoke him. They intended to let routine conversation reveal what carefully rehearsed public statements never would. My role remained unchanged. I would not participate in questioning, negotiations, or decision-making. I would simply preserve the historical records exactly as they had been discovered and remain available if authenticity ever became an issue. As I gathered my folders to leave, Lena handed me a sealed envelope containing certified copies of every document I had provided. She smiled for the first time since we met and quietly said that good evidence does not become stronger because people shout about it. It becomes stronger because every honest record agrees with the one before it. Walking into the cool afternoon air, I realized the investigation had quietly crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about proving what had happened. It was about watching the people responsible convince everyone themselves. 6 months later, the headlines finally caught up with the evidence that had been quietly waiting inside boxes, filing cabinets, survey maps, and forgotten records for years. Public announcements confirmed coordinated investigations across multiple jurisdictions involving fraudulent contracting practices, improper financial transfers, and systematic abuse of homeowner association authority. I never attended the press conferences. I never gave interviews. My role had ended the day I handed over every document exactly as I found it. Justice belongs in courtrooms and official reports, not in front of television cameras. Adrien Vale resigned from every remaining advisory position before formal proceedings moved forward. Several development projects stopped almost overnight, while independent auditors untangled years of transactions. Victoria Whitmore eventually agreed to provide truthful testimony regarding the internal operations she had participated in, accepting responsibility for her own decisions while confirming that pressure had flowed downward through a much larger organization. None of those outcomes erased what happened to my family, but they prevented countless other homeowners from walking into the same carefully constructed trap. One quiet Saturday morning, I stood beneath the old oak tree once again. Summer sunlight filtered through branches that had fully recovered, and the familiar sound of children riding bicycles echoed across a neighborhood that finally felt like a community instead of a battlefield disguised as suburbia. My mother's flowers had returned brighter than I remembered. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze without anyone sitting in it. I carried the small tin box that had started everything and placed it inside my father's restored fire-resistant cabinet beside the engineering drawings, the anonymous letter, and the photographs that survived both time and disaster. I left the cabinet unlocked. Secrets had protected the truth long enough. Knowledge belonged to everyone willing to preserve it honestly. A month later, several neighbors asked whether I would help organize free workshops explaining property rights, public records, and the importance of keeping complete documentation. We gathered in the rebuilt community hall with folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, and stacks of ordinary folders that suddenly seemed far more valuable than expensive promises. Watching families compare deeds, surveys, and association bylaws, I realized something my father understood decades before I ever did. Strong communities are not protected by the loudest voices or the wealthiest people. They are protected by ordinary neighbors who refuse to stop paying attention. Sometimes the smallest receipt becomes the strongest witness. Sometimes a forgotten survey changes the future of an entire county. And sometimes the quiet homeowner everyone overlooked turns out to be the one person patient enough to read every page before making a single move. Looking through the open front door toward the oak tree standing proudly against the Virginia sky, I smiled because the house was never the greatest thing my parents left me. They left me the discipline to protect what was true, the patience to let facts outlast fear, and the certainty that real justice never needs to raise its voice because, sooner or later, the record always speaks for itself.